And so we literally came back from school, climbed on our ponies, and we lived just under the downs. So we used to get on our ponies, ride up the downs,
In a moment the world never saw, King Charles crumbled behind palace gates, torn between love, loyalty, and an ultimatum no monarch should face. The weight of a crown he had waited a lifetime to wear suddenly became unbearable. He sat alone in the royal study, his breath shallow, his hand shaking as he held a letter he never thought he'd receive, not from his enemies, but from the woman he had defended, cherished, and crowned. Camilla had made it clear, "I won't go down alone." The words weren't a plea, they were a threat. In that chilling line, she had shattered every illusion of loyalty that had once bound them together. Sources close to the palace say he didn't speak. He simply stared ahead and wiped away a tear. Because what she held in her grasp wasn't just private letters or personal regrets, it was the future of the monarchy itself. The documents reportedly outlined private agreements, promises made in the dark corners of their rise, truths the world was never supposed to see. Letters that, if exposed, could unravel decades of royal reinvention. Charles, who had spent years mending the monarchy's fractured image, was now faced with a dilemma that no training, no tradition, no crown could prepare him for. Protect the throne by sacrificing the woman he loved, or protect her, and risk the monarchy imploding from within. The pain wasn't just emotional, it was existential. This wasn't a scandal that could be buried. It was a seismic threat that could realign the very core of royal legitimacy. His advisors were paralyzed. For once, they had no contingency plan, no spin, no scripted denial. Because this wasn't just about reputation, it was about truth. And it was weaponized. The betrayal didn't come from tabloids or rivals. It came from inside the palace, from a queen consort now clinging to power through quiet coercion. Behind closed doors, Charles's fragility was exposed. He had fought for Camilla, against public fury, against family resentment, against history itself. And now, she was willing to destroy it all. The man who once defied the nation to stand by her now stood utterly alone. And still, the storm outside was only gathering force, because what had begun as a whisper behind palace walls was about to erupt in the most public arena imaginable. Parliament was no stranger to royal intrigue, but what was coming would shake its foundations. The monarchy's pain was no longer private. It was about to become political. A silent war was turning into a public reckoning. The king's tears may have fallen in the shadows, but Anne's fury would land in full daylight. Yet the private implosion was only Act I. In Parliament, the royal war would ignite. On the ancient chamber floor, Princess Anne's words landed like cannon fire, stripping Camilla of titles in full public view. There was no warning, no ceremonial preamble, just the raw thunder of a royal reckoning broadcast lived to the heart of Britain's constitutional power. The chamber, usually echoing with the diplomatic tones of political debate, was instead struck dumb by the icy precision of Anne's declaration. Effective immediately, she said, Camilla is to be stripped of all honorary military and royal titles. The impact was immediate and seismic. The collective breath of the room caught mid-air, the silence that followed louder than any outcry. Members of Parliament didn't just hear the words they felt. Camilla, seated among them, didn't flinch at first, but her face turned, her posture shifted. Her hand gripped the edge of the bench like she needed to anchor herself. The moment had the weight of history and the sting of betrayal. Anne had not come to Parliament to request support or seek validation. She came to execute. Her voice didn't quiver. Her face betrayed nothing. She knew exactly what this would look like. That was the point. For decades, the royal family had buried its disputes behind palace walls, cloaking shame in civility. But Anne tore through that tradition with deliberate force. This wasn't a symbolic act or a gentle rebuke. It was judgment in its rawest form. Her move was unprecedented, striking not in private but at the heart of government, where every syllable is transcribed, every gesture recorded, and every consequence magnified. And in that setting, under the unforgiving glare of officialdom, Anne laid bare not just Camilla's status, but the monarchy's own unresolved wounds. It was not lost on anyone in the chamber that Anne's words carried more than authority. They carried memory. For those who remembered Diana, her quiet suffering, her unspoken vows, the speech felt like a ghost stepping into the room. Anne later confided to a trusted aide that Diana had once promised this day would come. She never said how. She never said when. But Anne remembered. And by choosing Parliament rather than a palace backroom, Anne ensured the monarchy's internal reckoning would be witnessed by the very institution meant to safeguard the nation. The move wasn't just punitive. It was poetic, a declaration of principle dressed as political thunder. And so, Camilla sat alone, exposed not just by the press, but by the institution she had fought so hard to enter. No allies stood by her side. Charles was notably absent. William nowhere to be seen. Even the usual royal loyalists offered no visible support. The silence was not accidental. It was tactical. In one thunderous moment, Anne had redrawn the lines of power, declaring where the monarchy now stood and who it would no longer protect. Camilla's identity, once fused with royal authority, was now unraveling under the weight of that single public sentence. But beneath the grandeur and the drama, a deeper question began to fester, one that would rattle the foundations of Buckingham Palace and ripple through every corridor of royal influence. This wasn't just a dethroning. This was a deliberate move, meticulously timed and strategically placed, which begged the question no one dared to ask aloud but everyone feared the answer to. Stripped of titles, Camilla's fate would hinge on one question. Why now, and why so publicly? Royal titles are far more than ceremonials. They're lifelines to influence, status, and legitimacy. And Camilla just lost them all. In a monarchy built on precision, perception, and protocol, titles are not mere decorations. They are weapons, shields, and keys. When Princess Anne stood in Parliament and announced the immediate revocation of Camilla's honors, it wasn't just a strike at ego, it was an institutional excommunication. Gone in a breath were her positions as honorary colonel of multiple elite regiments, her ceremonial role as patron of the Queen's Royal Medical Corps, and her title as honorary commander of the Naval Reserves. These weren't symbolic appointments for display, they were deliberate placements that signified acceptance, visibility, and royal clout. To lose them was to vanish in rank, in relevance, and in ritual. These roles shaped more than Camilla's calendar. They shaped her presence in the monarchy's intricate hierarchy. Titles decide where one stands in a receiving line, who speaks first, who rides where, who bows to whom. They determine who appears beside the monarch and who fades into the background. Without them, Camilla no longer holds the authority to speak at royal functions, no longer retains priority in palace protocol, no longer wields the soft power she spent decades cultivating. She is no longer the queen consort in influence, even if the title remains nominally intact. And this demotion doesn't just touch her, it sends shockwaves through every organization, regiment, and institution that once bore her name as patron. Her absence is more than a gap, it's a message. In the strict architecture of royal protocol, symbolism is substance. And in stripping Camilla of her honors, Anne didn't just demote her, she elevated herself. By default and design, Anne now stands above Camilla in both hierarchy and narrative. The once subtle line between them has become a chasm, one that reorders how both the public and the palace must treat them. It is not just about ceremonial duties, it is about who speaks for the crown when the monarch is silent. In one stroke, Anne became the royal voice of moral authority, while Camilla became a shadow of the role she once fiercely claimed. Anne's justification was chilling in its clarity. This was not personal, it was principle. In her own words, this was justice. Not vengeance for past slights or lingering wounds, but a decisive act to restore integrity to a crown she believes has drifted. Anne made no attempt to soften the blow, no apology for the scale of what she'd done. To her, the monarchy's dignity had been compromised, and her actions were the necessary remedy. And in that logic, every stripped title became a symbol of restoration, not just a punishment, but a purge, a royal reset. But grand gestures reverberate deeper. Why strike when Camilla's influence seemed strongest? Why now? And what was Anne really trying to protect? The answer lies not only in timing, but in what Anne feared would come next. Because beneath every revoked honor was something darker. A silent fear that Camilla's hold wasn't just ceremonial, but strategic. And that fear was about to be exposed. This wasn't an impulsive sibling rivalry. It was a masterstroke, months in planning, surgical in timing, rooted in Diana's legacy. Anne's move in Parliament had the precision of a scalpel, not the bluster of a grudge. Behind her calm delivery was a meticulous strategy that had been quietly engineered with the help of trusted advisors, legal minds, and veteran courtiers. Every word she spoke was calculated. Every title she revoked was chosen for maximum impact. This wasn't just about removing Camilla from the royal spotlight, it was about removing her from the foundation of influence she had built over decades. And Anne knew that if she were to succeed in altering the monarchy's direction, it had to be done not in whispers behind closed doors, but in the open, where the palace couldn't twist or dilute the narrative. The brilliance of Anne's plan lay in its delivery. By making the declaration in the hallowed chamber of Parliament, she made the monarchy's internal reckoning a matter of public record. If she had acted privately, the palace machinery could have softened the blow, rewritten the headlines, or buried the moment in controlled press releases. But Anne didn't give them that chance. She dragged the truth out into the light, giving it a permanence that could not be erased or rebranded. Her timing was no less deliberate. She struck just as public favor toward Camilla appeared to peak, when her influence felt almost untouchable. That was the moment Anne chose to strike, and by doing so, she turned Camilla's strength into her greatest vulnerability. But this wasn't just political warfare. It was a reckoning decades in the making. Anne had carried Diana's private words like a vow etched into her memory. Diana had once said, in a moment of pain, that there would come a day when truth would eclipse tradition. Anne had listened. And now, with Camilla seated behind her in Parliament, stripped of protection and titles, Anne fulfilled that silent promise. She wasn't acting out of vengeance, she was executing a moral mission. She believed the monarchy had drifted from its core, and that to restore its dignity, she had to cut away the rot, even if that rot wore a crown. Anne didn't stand alone. The old guard, those who remembered a monarchy of duty over spectacle, stood quietly behind her. Senior courtiers who had long harbored doubts about Camilla's rise, Commonwealth dignitaries who had grown uncomfortable with the direction of the crown. None of them spoke loudly, but their silence gave Anne strength. Her next moves were equally deliberate. Attending military ceremonies with quiet solemnity, delivering speeches on service and sacrifice, offering subtle nods to the values Diana had championed. She never spoke Camilla's name again, but every public act became a mirror, and in that mirror, Camilla vanished further. As Anne fortified her image, Camilla's world began to implode. Time for her counterplay. In one televised blow, Camilla faced the unthinkable. Her decades-long climb to queen consort was undone, dignity gone in an instant. The woman who had weathered storms of public scorn, media frenzy, and familial rejection now found herself alone, stripped not just of titles, but of the identity she had meticulously built over years. The broadcast showed only a glimpse of her motionless posture, her eyes blank, aides quietly surrounding her like shadows, but inside, something had shattered. The palace staff had seen her stand tall through relentless press assaults and cold receptions, but this time, she didn't stand. She didn't speak. She didn't even nod in acknowledgement. As one aide whispered later, she wasn't furious, she was unraveling. The arc of Camilla's life had always been marked by contradiction. First the outsider, then the mistress, and finally the legitimized queen consort, each step forward, hard-fought, each acceptance earned through a mix of patience, public charm, and royal allegiance. She had survived decades of comparison to a ghost that never left the palace. Diana. She had endured headlines that tore her apart, seeing her face caricatured as scandal personified. And still, she stood beside Charles on the palace balcony, hailed as his partner in reign. That rise had not come easily. It came from grinding silence, calculated appearances, and relentless rebranding. But now, in a single pronouncement from Anne, it was all erased. And this time, there would be no second chance to rewrite the narrative. The pain wasn't in the loss of ceremony, it was in the betrayal. For all her past trials, Camilla had believed she had finally crossed the threshold from tolerated to trusted. That belief shattered the moment her titles fell away. It wasn't just a strategic move, it felt deeply personal. Aide after aide reported seeing her stunned into disbelief, too silent to respond, too broken to recover. She wasn't angry. She wasn't plotting revenge, not yet. She was simply lost, a woman suddenly questioning whether the years she had spent fighting for recognition had ever truly meant anything. And in that moment, the past seemed to close in on her, every whisper of doubt, every cold shoulder, every moment she thought she had finally arrived, now rewritten as a lie. The humiliation was tailor-made. Anne's announcement wasn't a leak or a whisper. It was an orchestrated spectacle, televised, transcribed, and immortalized. The world saw not just a queen consort reduced, but a woman diminished, with no one beside her to soften the fall. Not Charles, not William, not a single royal ally. The palace, once her sanctuary, now echoed with uncertainty. "This isn't a political defeat," one senior official muttered. "It's a personal collapse." And with Camilla's shield shattered, the monarchy's mask began to slip. Behind palace doors, alarms rang louder than ever. Communications teams scrambled. Schedules were torn apart, and high-level meetings were convened in whispers. The institution could no longer pretend. This was not a contained incident, it was a full-scale fracture. The palace lurched into crisis mode. Damage control began, but calm was far from returning. Phones rang off the hook in Buckingham. Once sea-tight operation rooms turned battlefield as aides scrambled to contain a constitutional explosion. Within minutes of Anne's thunderous declaration, the palace descended into chaos. Schedules were shredded. Press officers abandoned routine updates. Senior advisors locked themselves in strategy rooms as the realization hit. This wasn't just a scandal. This was an unmitigated royal catastrophe. King Charles, already shaken behind closed doors, abruptly canceled a planned speech at a children's charity, an event long prepared to project stability and unity. His silence wasn't a choice, it was paralysis. And in his absence, the palace machine began spinning wildly, unsure who was in charge, or what the monarchy even stood for anymore. The internal confusion split along two warring lines: legal and public relations. One camp urged constitutional caution, poring over arcane documents and past precedents, desperate to understand whether Anne had legally overstepped. Could a senior royal, without sovereign consent, unilaterally strip titles in public? The answer wasn't clear. The monarchy thrives on precedent, and this moment had none. Meanwhile, the communications wing was imploding. They had no prepared statement, no media counter, no coordinated message. Within hours, the press ran wild. Front pages blared headlines like "Queen No More" and "Diana's Justice Served." Social media went into meltdown. Hashtags like #JusticeDiana, #PrincessPower, and #Monarchy Meltdown trended across continents. Television panels argued long into the night, some praising Anne as the monarchy's moral compass, others condemning her for igniting a civil war in crowns. But the damage wasn't limited to optics. Behind the palace gates, fractures deepened into factions. Staff who once worked shoulder to shoulder now whispered in corners, aligning quietly behind one royal or the other. Those loyal to Anne believed she was saving the monarchy's soul. Those still devoted to Camilla believed she was being sacrificed to ghosts that could never be satisfied. The atmosphere inside the palace grew colder by the hour. Confidential memos were leaked. Schedules shifted without notice. Junior aides quit. The very heart of the monarchy, the illusion of unity, was breaking, and no one could stop it. Public opinion, once a background concern, surged to the front. Polls taken within a day of Anne's speech showed a shocking 68% approval of her actions. But beneath that surface was a growing divide. Older generations applauded the return to duty and dignity. Younger voices pushed back, questioning why a woman who had served the crown for years was being humiliated for her past. Commentators debated not just the scandal but the foundation of the monarchy itself. If tradition could be rewritten so suddenly, what else could be questioned? What else could collapse? And through it all, Camilla said nothing. But silence does not mean surrender. As the institution teetered on the edge of reputational ruin, a quieter storm was forming, because while Buckingham Palace scrambled to contain the fallout, Camilla's allies were quietly repositioning the narrative. His tears dried, her resolve crystallized. From legal strategies to sympathetic voices in the press, Camilla wasn't vanishing quietly. What many believed was the end of her reign was, in her mind, merely the beginning of a different battle. In the silence following Anne's public strike, Camilla retreated not in defeat but in preparation. Inside Clarence House, legal minds were summoned, advisors huddled, and lines were drawn. The first question was the most important. Could Anne legally strip titles without the sovereign's explicit consent? The royal legal scholars were split. Precedence for such an act was nearly non-existent. One aide reportedly murmured, "She may have gone too far." And just like that, Camilla found her first crack in Anne's carefully built armor. But Camilla knew the law alone wouldn't save her. The court of public opinion had always been her greatest threat, and now it had to become her strongest weapon. She began where few expected, with her legacy of service. Retired generals and colonels who had served under her honorary roles came forward with unwavering loyalty. She earned every inch of that uniform, one stated bluntly. Charity leaders echoed the sentiment. Her involvement wasn't ceremonial. She showed up. She fought for our causes. These weren't grand televised speeches, but targeted testimonies that humanized her, softened her image, and sowed doubt into the narrative Anne had unleashed. Then came the press, a domain Camilla had once dreaded, now strategically embraced. Trusted journalists, long sympathetic to her journey, penned op-eds that reframed her as more than a royal figurehead. They cast her as a woman who had climbed from scandal to service, weathered the wrath of a nation, and emerged not flawless, but faithful. "Don't erase a queen who earned her crown," read one viral headline. It wasn't spin, it was a counter-narrative. And it worked. Sympathy began to resurface, not in sweeping waves, but in steady, determined voices. The question began to shift from what did she lose to, was it right to take it away? And just as momentum began to gather, Camilla revealed her most powerful card, the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II. Quietly, her team reminded the public of Elizabeth's open and formal endorsement of Camilla as Queen Consort. That public nod, rare, specific, and unprecedented, was now reframed as a royal decree of trust. "The late queen believed in her," said one family friend. "That matters more than a public spectacle." It wasn't just about roles or ranks, it was about a monarch's will, spoken before the world, and now seemingly undone by internal rebellion. The narrative was turning. Camilla was no longer the cold-hearted interloper many had accused her of being. She was now being seen, in some corners, as a woman betrayed by the very institution she devoted herself to. The shift didn't erase the damage, but it complicated the blame. She wasn't disappearing into silence. She was re-emerging as something more dangerous, sympathetic, strategic, and suddenly empowered. With Camilla rallying and Anne's power ascending, all eyes turned back to Charles. Where would the king stand? Between two pillars of his world, Camilla and Anne, King Charles stood alone, his heart breaking, his crown teetering, and the monarchy on the brink. The walls of the palace could not muffle the weight pressing down on him. He wasn't issuing statements. He wasn't strategizing with his cabinet. He was simply still. Inside his study, pages of drafted speeches lay crumpled across the desk, each version torn apart by doubt. The king, who had always been seen as a man of contemplation, was now paralyzed by the gravity of choice. Reports from insiders whispered of a man withdrawn, thinner, quieter. The stress wasn't just emotional, it was physical. His health had begun to show the toll of a decision, too heavy for any crown to bear. The Constitution that once granted him ceremonial immunity now bound him in chains. If Charles were to reverse Anne's move, he risked a constitutional rupture that could shake the monarchy's very framework. Publicly opposing her, especially after her actions in Parliament, would be viewed as undermining due process, perhaps even triggering a political backlash. And yet, standing idly while Camilla was stripped and humiliated, sent its own chilling message that the monarch had abandoned his own queen. The contradiction was impossible to untangle. Charles was not just a husband or a brother. He was a sovereign, expected to rise above personal ties. But now, personal ties were all that remained. In a rare moment of raw emotion, Charles reportedly confided to a close advisor, "I love her, but I can't undo this." Those 7 words echoed louder than any royal decree. They revealed the bleeding heart of a man who had spent a lifetime waiting to rule, only to find the throne had become a prison. Every step he took toward defending Camilla threatened to unravel Anne's authority. Every moment he remained silent drove a wedge deeper into the woman he had defended through scandal, rejection, and decades of public resistance. And so, he did nothing. And in doing nothing, he allowed the world to write the narrative for him. The advisors surrounding him were no better aligned. Some urged caution, "Don't act. Let it blow over." Others warned that inaction would be his undoing. "You'll look weak, like a man who can't protect his own family." The room where Charles once held court now echoed with division. Every option had consequences, none offered clarity. And while the palace wrestled with internal fractures, the nation watched with growing unease. Time was no longer a luxury. Each day of silence further unspooled the seams of stability. Polls shifted, headlines sharpened. Even his own family began to distance themselves, unsure whether to rally behind a king caught in crisis or wait for the dust to settle. But the longer Charles hesitated, the more fragile his position became. He wasn't just delaying a statement, he was inviting collapse. And with the monarchy fraying at its core, the question shifted from what he would do to whether he still could. As Charles wondered if legacy or love would win, the monarchy's backbone, heir and institution grew shaky. The tears have fallen, the threat delivered, now everything hinges on Charles's next move. The monarchy dances on a knife's edge. With every hour that passed, silence from the king only amplified the noise outside. William and Kate, forced into a series of scheduled appearances, moved through public engagements with an eerie restraint. Their smiles were tense, their eyes avoiding questions. Cameras caught the subtle distance between them, the clipped handshakes, the tight nods. They were not leading, they were waiting. And yet, the weight of expectation pressed against them. If Charles faltered, they would be next in line, not just by blood, but by duty. But neither dared speak of succession, because to do so would mean admitting what the palace had been avoiding, that the crown was trembling. Behind the scenes, the confusion rippled far beyond Britain's borders. Commonwealth leaders began issuing quiet inquiries. Who was representing the monarchy now? Was Anne's authority official or symbolic? Was Camilla still to be treated as consort or sidelined entirely? Diplomats reported back with words like unclear, sensitive, and unprecedented. The once unchallenged line of royal continuity had blurred, and with it, so had global confidence in the crown's stability. Some nations began pressing for clarity, others quietly prepared contingency plans. The unity the monarchy had long symbolized was unraveling, thread by thread. And then came the whispers, not from tabloids, but from inside the royal establishment itself. Operation Menai Bridge, Charles's succession plan, surfaced in hushed tones and private meetings. It wasn't because the king was dying, it was because, in the eyes of some, his reign was bleeding legitimacy. If he couldn't resolve this crisis, if he allowed the family to spiral into war, if public support continued to erode, then abdication wouldn't just be a rumor. It would become a necessity. The plan, meticulously prepared for the inevitable, was now being studied for the unthinkable. Charles faced three choices, each more treacherous than the last. He could reinstate Camilla's titles and risk appearing weak, undermining Anne's stand, and confirming his crown was a puppet of sentiment. He could throw his support behind Anne, severing emotional ties and alienating Camilla entirely, all while risking public backlash for appearing cruel and politically calculated. Or he could remain frozen, doing nothing, and watch both women pull the monarchy apart from opposite sides. No choice promised peace. Every path promised pain. And hovering above it all was one final specter, Camilla's secrets. The letters she threatened to release, the stories locked in drawers and diaries, the possibility that she could turn personal history into a public scandal. If pushed too far, would she detonate the monarchy to save herself? And if so, how far would Charles go to stop her? His next move wasn't just a decision. It was a reckoning, a defining moment that would either stitch the crown back together or rip it in half. When personal betrayal meets constitutional power, only one question remains. Will King Charles act, or will the monarchy fracture beyond repair? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.